We often hear these myths about capitalism, and there's no period in history more widely misunderstood than that of the British and American Industrial Revolution time period of the 19th century. So let's have a listen to what this guy has to say.
It's scary to think that in some ways, the leaders of the largest corporations on the globe may hold more power than elected officials.
Well, this is the problem, because you would have to ask the question of how did they actually get to that position, and as we will see, that was actually a result of government's intervention.
But luckily enough, we have the powers of government regulation, ways of stopping uncontrollable enterprise from taking total control of society.
This is one of the most erroneous myths about capitalism. They claim that in the 19th century, these giant corporations and trusts somehow held monopolies and that they were able to put out dangerous quality products and shaft the consumer. As you will see from a video I touched upon before on the Antitrust Myths, the consumer price index was continuously falling, and the giant corporations and trusts were able to provide a far more efficient service and cheaper service than that of their competition. This was the reason why you had special interest groups who, out of their own interest, began lobbying their own state legislator and Congress to lay on the antitrust laws, which in turn essentially created monopolies. Prior to the antitrust laws, there were no monopolies, because the idea of a monopoly is predicated on this view that the business or corporations would be able to shaft the consumer and drive up their costs at free will. Just like Standard Oil and many of them, they were forced to continue on driving down their costs due to competition.
I mean, for the most part. But as bad as it may seem today, it used to be worse. Oh boy, yes sirree, was it worse. There was a time when the power of the United States was undoubtedly in the hands of a select few businessmen. The robber barons, the captains of industry. Call them what you like, but they controlled everything.
Pay close attention to what he has to say and you will hear the contradiction.
It's scary to think that in some ways, the leaders of the largest corporations on the globe may hold more power than elected officials.
So he acknowledges the fact that corporatocracy exists today and that giant corporations dominate over the marketplace and have power over the government. But the question is, how did they actually get there? To be fair to him, he did say that things were a lot worse before the antitrust laws. But as I pointed out, this is a complete myth, because before the antitrust laws, there were no monopolies, and monopolies have never stemmed from that of predatory pricing. Let's just move on with his argument.
This was a time of unprecedented growth, and sure, businesses had massive profits and power in years past, but nothing like this.
I don't know about you people, but when he touches upon there being unprecedented growth, I don't really see what the problem is with that. Let's just move on with what he has to say.
Why? How? When? Who? Don't worry, Jimmy, your boy Tyler's got you covered, because today we're looking at the Gilded Age. So, in the latter half of the 1800s, it was becoming quickly apparent that new technology would soon change everything. The Second Industrial Revolution. Earlier in the century, we saw some steamboats and we had some factories, but this was something more. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. We'll be focusing on a select few titans of enterprise in this video rather than covering them all, because yeah, there's a lot. So to get started, we'll go back to a fine young fellow, Cornelius Vanderbilt.
First, understand before we move on to his argument on Cornelius Vanderbilt, the United States of America wanted to become the world leader of the steamship industry over that of their competitor, Great Britain. Edward Collins had lobbied Congress for that of state subsidies to finance his steamship industry. And of course, he started off with a $400,000 subsidy. He then later went back a year after to Congress and asked for a $600,000 subsidy, and then eventually went up to $800,000 and then $1 million in a subsidy. Now, his business was inefficient. He had about 4 steamships, and that was because of the subsidies. That's a whole other argument you could go into. His competitor, Cornelius Vanderbilt, was running efficiently and he took no subsidies whatsoever. So Cornelius Vanderbilt was playing basically fairly by the free market. What turned out was the steamship industry under Edward Collins went into eventual bankruptcy. It wasn't because of Cornelius Vanderbilt, it was simply because he was completely inefficient. Cornelius Vanderbilt was actually giving him a showing up, because Congress eventually said, we're not giving you any more money, that's it. You've wasted the rest of it. And that's an example of the difference between a political entrepreneur of Edward Collins and this of a market entrepreneur of Cornelius Vanderbilt. But let's just have a listen to what he has to say about Cornelius Vanderbilt.
Born on Staten Island, New York, US of A, baby, in 1794. As a young man, he had access to one fine specimen of a ferry. How he got it, who knows. Some say he borrowed money, some say his dad had it. I really don't care. What matters is he made a living with this ferry. He took people from Staten Island all the way to Manhattan. People called him the Commodore because he was on a boat and whatnot. But that one boat soon turned into a fleet, and that fleet soon turned into a really, really big fleet.
On a side note of what he doesn't actually tell you, and the reason why Cornelius Vanderbilt became so dominant in the steamship industry is because he was a market entrepreneur that simply ran his business by the free market, took no subsidies. Meanwhile, it was through the government's interference and through the state subsidies that led to such inefficiency with regards to the other competitors who were political entrepreneurs, and that's why their businesses ended up a failure, much like I explained about that of the Edward Collins steamship industry.
By this point, he's really wealthy. He lent his ships to the military for the Civil War and all around was just a good old nautical fellow. But he knew the future wasn't boats. He saw something else. The railroads. They weren't entirely new, but they were getting pretty popular. And by the time the Transcontinental Railroad was built, it was apparent that this was the next big industry.
Another thing that he doesn't tell you is that the only successful built efficient railroad was the Great Northern Railroad that was built by a market entrepreneur called James J. Hill, much like that of Cornelius Vanderbilt. To quote James J. Hill, he said, "The government should not furnish capital to these companies in addition to their enormous land subsidies to enable them to conduct their business in competition with enterprises that have received no aid from the public treasury." In other words, James J. Hill was strongly opposed to all of the subsidies and government's interference, to leave things down to the free market, a market entrepreneur. And of course he built the Great Northern Railroad much quicker and at a far cheaper cost. Now, he was far more efficient than that of his competitors, and that's why he was successful. It wasn't because of some special interest favours. He didn't lobby anyone for the sake of any subsidies. And it just so happened to be, again, much like the steamship industry, those who did enact in the subsidies led to eventual bankruptcy.
The importance of rail transportation is lost on many people these days. Back then, it was the only way to get across large distances in a modest time frame. Just as important, it allowed entrepreneurs to sell their products nationwide, something that would otherwise be basically impossible. As the products reach larger markets, profits increase, both for the producer and the guy who delivers it. So yeah, it's important. He starts selling his boats, all his boats, puts the money into the rail industry, and soon the Commodore begins to witness the benefits of unyielding economic power. After all, the more profits you have gives you the more power to regulate your own prices, fairly or otherwise. Competition and customers are fed up with this pricing, being pretty mean to them. Old Vanderbilt doesn't take kindly to this and literally stops all rail transport into and out of New York City. Just stops it. The opposition loses value as stocks drop, and Old Vanderbilt is right there to buy them up, creating the crisis that ruins the competition just to buy the competition.
This story is very similar to John Davis and Rockefeller and Standard Oil, where they claim that through an unfair competitive advantage through rebates, that John Davis and Rockefeller wiped out his competition and they could not compete. The truth of the matter is, he was fairly rewarded those rebates, and most importantly, The other businesses were going out of competition, going out of business before the rebates. His company was forced to continue on driving down his costs in the 1870s due to competition, so he still had competition on his back. In the 1860s, the reason why these oil refinery companies could not compete with John Davis and Rockefeller was because they were completely inefficient. John Davis and Rockefeller was overly obsessed with efficiency, and this is why he gained such dominance in the marketplace by that of 1869 in the oil refinery business. When the cost of a barrel of oil continued to drop during the 1860s, this meant these companies were making massive losses, and that was the reason why, because the more and more oil refinery companies entered the marketplace, the more the cost would continue to drive down. And due to the big losses they were making through their inefficiency, that was the very reason for why they were going out of business. It had nothing at all to do with Rockefeller as such, other than Rockefeller fairly outdone his competition through economic efficiency.
Just wonderful. And all the while, more railways are built. Just tons of railways all over the place. Possibly too many. Actually, yes, definitely too many. Not much potential remains in the rail building industry since over the past few decades enough seem to have been constructed. So Vanderbilt wants a new revenue source. If he can't build more railways, what if he can find new cool things to put on those railways? Intriguing. What he finds is kerosene. Kerosene lets people just light lamps every night and gain the ability to see when it was previously dark. It was booming, and that popularity would soon take it from commodity to necessity, and Vanderbilt wanted in. So he gets a hold of an up-and-coming businessman, John D. Rockefeller. Yeah, we talked about him a long time ago on this channel, but we're gonna do it again for just a bit. Context and whatnot. Johnny agrees to stock Vanderbilt's rail cars with lots of oil, and Rockefeller follows through, and starts building an empire of his own. He buys other companies, and his market share rises to 90%. Now he has the power. He becomes too big for just Vanderbilt. He goes to other railroad magnates as well, including Tom Scott. He gets a bit of an ego and starts making what seems like to them unreasonable demands.
Okay, I don't really need to go into too much detail on John Davis and Rockefeller. Like I've explained so many times before, between 1869, where it would cost more than 30 cents per barrel of oil, by 1897, even long after he gained 90% share of the market, it would only cost 5.9 cents per barrel of oil, which completely contradicts the entire meaning of a monopoly. One of his main competitors was the producer and seller of the electric light bulb. There was no way that John Davis and Rockefeller could keep his costs high when his competition was producing and selling electric light bulbs. Rockefeller's business, although yes, he bought over those companies and put them in favourable positions, that's something he doesn't tell you. He doesn't tell you the fact that he continued to drive down his costs because of competition, and it was more beneficial for his business. The society as a whole became richer as a result of it, and as a result of his business, he opened up that of opportunity for Henry Ford's automobile industry. So he better improved the material standards of living of everyone as a whole. The idea of a monopoly is predicated on this idea that they dominate the marketplace and then they just, for whatever reason, shaft the consumer by driving up the costs. You didn't see that. Instead, you saw a higher level of productive output. Therefore, there was not a monopoly.
The railroad industry wasn't doing too hot at this point. You know how I said there was too many railroads? Well, they just kept building them. Just so many. The whole industry was weak with overexposure, and the companies weren't in their prime anymore. They wanted some respect back. So Scott and Vanderbilt just refuse. They've thought, he can't ship it without us. Why does this man think he deserves these rates? If we don't ship it, he can't make money. He needs us. But they were wrong. Rockefeller just decided he would find a way to transport it himself. Not with trains, but pipeline. And if the pipeline couldn't reach a refinery, just shut it down. Better than giving the old train guys their day in the sun. Now, around this time, things were going pretty bad for the railroads. But you know who else wasn't having the best time? the people working on the railroads, and the refineries, and the steel mills, and, well, everything for that matter.
Again, this is something that I don't need to go into too much detail upon. Much like the North Pacific Railroad Company that was being given these subsidies, there were so many other companies that were being given these subsidies, the same thing in the steamship industry, and it just so happened to be those who were taking the subsidies from government political entrepreneurs were the very businesses that were going out of competition, that were basically going bankrupt. The way he's trying to paint it is as if some unfair thing came along, such as to blame Rockefeller or something, and all dominance, and therefore they're the reason for why those businesses went out of competition. Anyway, folk, I think I've covered most of the argument. If you've got any questions you would like to ask, comment in the comment section below. Be sure to like the video, favourite the video, share the video playlist or whatever, and of course, thank you for watching. I shall talk to you later. Cheers.